Hello and welcome to Conversations with Mother Earth, brought to you by Grounded Press. My name is Dana Petrovic, and each week my guests and I explore one aspect of Mother Earth and the gifts that she gives us. We also discuss why these gifts are so precious and why we should value them. We got you curious? Good. We love curiosity. Let's start. I have a confession to make today, dear listeners. I have serendipity to thank for my today's guest on Conversations with Mother Earth. My meeting with Christian Busch happened by chance and ended in a beneficial way, which is what serendipity means. Christian reached out on LinkedIn, and after visiting his profile, I eagerly invited him to speak because I discovered his fascinating book, The Serendipity Mindset. I believe that this is a topic all of us ought to be interested in, because haven't we all met extraordinary people when we least expected it? And these people became our spouses, best friends, business partners. And sometimes we meet people that we don't like so much. So my today's guest is Dr. Christian Busch, who grew up in Heidelberg, Germany, but teaches at the New York University and the London School of Economics. At NYU, he directs the global economy program at the Center of Global Affairs. Christian, welcome to Conversations with Mother Earth.
Thanks so much for having me, Dana.
Well, I'm certainly glad that the serendipity brought you and I together. So kindly tell our listeners, what prompted you to write this serendipity mindset?
Yeah, it's been a longer origin story in the sense that it started a couple of decades ago. You know, I used to be this kid that I was kicked out of high school. I had to repeat a year, had a certain reckless lifestyle, focused on the day-to-day and just enjoying life. And then I transferred this into my driving style, probably helped the unofficial world record of how many dustbins you can knock over on your way to school. And then one day I wasn't so lucky anymore. I crashed into 4 parked cars, and all cars were completely destroyed, including my own. And I won't forget the policeman who came to the scene, and he was like, "Oh my God, he's still alive." And this idea that I was supposed to be dead, that stuck with me. And it took me on this intense search for meaning. I asked myself a lot of questions, who would have come to my funeral? Was it all worth it? What is life all about? And I only had a lot of depressing answers. And so I started reading this wonderful book, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which is all about that question of how do we find meaning in crisis and meaning in tough situations. And what I realized is that what I enjoy doing the most is connecting ideas, connecting people. And so I started out as a community builder. We set up a community called Sandbox Network that brings together young innovators around the world and helps them make ideas happen. And then I went more towards working with CEOs on, purpose-driven companies. And at some point, the inner imposter came out and said, "Look, Christian, you're, trying to make all these things happen, but essentially we're just, building the plane while we're flying it. What do we actually know? We're claiming all this impact we're having, but what do we know?" And so I went a bit more into academia, saying, what are the patterns behind success and failure? What makes some people more successful and joyful than others? And what I found fascinating is that both in that kind of journey as entrepreneur and social entrepreneur and in my research, what popped up everywhere was serendipity. The most successful, purpose-driven people, they seem to have in common that they cultivate serendipity. They constantly see something in the unexpected and turn that into positive outcomes. And so I got really fascinated by that question. Is there a science-based framework for that? Can we develop a science-based framework for how we can create more serendipity, more unexpected good luck in our lives? And so that's really what the book is about, and that's what a lot of my work is about, to say, how can we develop that framework, but also what are exercises we can use in the day-to-day to create more luck for ourselves and for the people we love.
It's interesting, but it sounds like my life, what you're mentioning, because when I look back, and I'm sure my listeners too, when we look back, we can't explain certain things, but yet they happened and they brought us to where we are today, good and bad. We'll talk about that a little bit later. You mentioned the term luck, and you in your book you talk about you use the term smart luck, and for some listeners this might sound like a contradiction, even an oxymoron. What do you mean with the term smart luck? Because we are more used to the term like destiny, fate, chance, even blind luck. But what is smart luck?
Yeah, well, it's really in contrast to the blind luck, right? Blind luck being all the things we can't really control, like being born into a loving family, or, you know, stuff that essentially passively happens to us, but it's just dumb luck, right? And then serendipity really is about smart luck. It's about luck we have to work for. You will hear a lot of times, you know, among successful people, they will say something like, well, I worked really hard to be lucky, right? And it's really this idea that how do you build a muscle for luck? And you know, if you look at serendipity, the beautiful thing is when you really look at the patterns behind how, you know, I'm sure a lot of the listeners will maybe have found the love of their life via serendipity, or their job, or, you know, Viagra, all these different things, innovations, inventions, up to 50% of those emerge unexpectedly. But there's always a certain process. And the process is always, there's some kind of serendipity trigger, right? Some kind of unexpected chance event. But then it's about us connecting the dots and doing something with it. And that's really the active element. And that's really what we can train. We can create more serendipity triggers, so we can create more meaningful accidents, but also we can learn how to make accidents more meaningful. And so that's really the two aspects we can work on. And to, you know, give you a tangible or two tangible examples. One is really around saying, imagine, you know, if you have erratic hand movements like I do, you spill a lot of coffee, right? So imagine you spill a coffee in a coffee shop over someone, you spill that coffee and you sense some kind of connection with that person. You don't know what it is, but you just sense something. And now you have a couple of options, right? Option number one is you just say, I'm sorry. You walk outside and you think, what could have happened had I spoken with that person? And then option number two, you start a conversation, that person becomes the love of your life, your co-founder, your investor, you name it. The point is, what we made with that unexpected moment predetermines a lot of what happens in the long run. And then second, and what I'm really even more excited about, is how do we create more unexpected moments that can create serendipity? And one of my favorites there is the hook strategy. And the hook strategy is really about saying, how can I use every interaction, every conversation to cast a couple of hooks, to seed a couple of potential triggers? So, you know, there's this wonderful entrepreneur in London called Ollie Barrett. And if you would ask Ollie, what do you do? You know, this dreaded question that we get asked at every conference and everywhere we go, he wouldn't just say, I'm a technology entrepreneur. He would say something like, I'm a technology entrepreneur. I recently started reading into the philosophy of science, but what I'm really excited about is playing the piano. And so what he's doing here is he's giving you three hooks where you could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. I recently started hosting piano matinees. You should come by. Oh my God, such a coincidence. My sister is teaching on the philosophy of science. You should be a guest lecturer. The point is, the more we can get clarity about a couple of interests we want to seed into conversations, the more we allow other people to connect the dots for us, and by that create serendipity.
Yeah. Yes and no. I do agree with you to a certain point. But I do also, I mean, as being both professors, you know that in our academic world, when you also sometimes say, I'm a professor, I'm an author, I'm a TEDx speaker. Sometimes it does confuse people, though.
And I think that's where it gets really interesting, right? To really, it's literally kind of working on your own elevator pitch, but in a very discreet way, right? Because it's not about pitching people. It's not about throwing at people as many elements as possible and saying, I'm a speaker, I'm this, like that kind of like puts people off, right? But it's more about saying, how do I seed things into a conversation so that people can pick whatever they find most interesting? right? And so, for example, take the example, like I'm at the moment extremely excited about the question of how do we take a serendipity mindset into every education system and every company. And so in every conversation, I try to seed that in. Some people pick it up, other people don't. But the point is, if I do that with a couple of elements, that is where serendipity happens, because we give people an excuse to essentially say, oh, this is interesting, versus kind of like not talk about the other things. So I completely agree. It's not about just throwing stuff at people. It's about having a narrative. It's about building a narrative and bringing it in an intuitive way.
Yeah. I mean, what makes us also a whole human being, because we are not only professors, we are not only authors, we also married, we have a spouse, we have a family, each human being is so faceted in so many ways, and this is what makes us beautiful. This makes us interesting, exactly these aspects. So I'm glad that the world is a little bit changing, and we are allowed to be and this and that and say that in a setting. But one topic that is repeated by a lot of trainers, coaches, we even focus on this in our leadership training, is the topic of focus. Everybody talks, we should have a vision, we should have a clear focus, we should drive towards it. How does that work with serendipity?
It's interesting. We just finished a study with 43 of the world's top performing CEOs. So essentially, we sat down with the CEOs of MasterCard and other companies and said, what is it that really makes you successful? And what's interesting about them is that, all of them have an extremely clear idea of where approximately they want to go, right? So the CEO of MasterCard would be, I want to lift 500 million people into the financial system. Here's an approximate plan, but then I will be open to unexpected encounters that we have to, in a fast changing world, be open to, so that the really interesting things happen. So what I've observed with interesting leaders is that, the old leadership style is to say, this is the exact plan, this is exactly how it works, and everything that goes wrong then is a mistake, right? It's a leadership failure. Versus with these high performing CEOs, it's really about saying, we have an approximate idea of where we're going, but also we have the humility to say we can't know everything, and we make that part of the plan. And because we make it part of the plan, it doesn't become a weakness. It's not that Ajay Banga at MasterCard would then, in 5 months, when someone says, oh my God, I found an unexpected solution of how to bring these 500 million people into the financial system, that now he looks like a weak leader. Quite the opposite. He told me from the beginning, he wants me to bring in these new solutions so that we can actually accomplish this vision together. And so that's really what we, in our own lives as well, right? This idea that the more we know about what are our values, principles, interests, some kind of North Star that helps guide us, the easier it gets to connect unexpected things to that. But also, I work a lot with students, right? Like similar to you, and one of the things I find interesting is that when you're a 20-year-old student, you don't know what exactly you want to do with your life, and you shouldn't. Like that's not your job at that point. I grew up in Germany. They told me I would always have to know what exactly to do, how exactly to do it. That's not how life happens, right? Yeah. And the problem then is we get anxious because we think, oh my God, life should be exactly this way. No, what I'm essentially talking with 20-year-old students about is to say, hey, write down a couple of things you're interested in, and then rubber stamp forward. Go into different types of communities, figure out what you find most interesting, and open your mind to this, so that then essentially you can go closer to what you're really interested in, and what then also can get, bread on the table, and then kind of combine what you're excited about and what really kind of, enables you to live a meaningful life. But so long story short, to your point, serendipity is not about saying we don't need planning. It's not about saying we don't need a vision. It's actually saying, let's build into our vision or into our idea of life that the unexpected will happen, and let's make it part of the plan so that it becomes an ally rather than a threat.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying, because where leaders are aware of our what we call the VUCA world, all the volatility, uncertainty, ambiguity, around us. It's important that we keep an open mind, and as you mentioned in your book, we should also be careful that we don't take one serendipitous event and turn it into a pattern, and we expect that this will happen over and over again, because actually this sticking to the pattern is the opposite of what serendipity per se is, and we should actually be open to the unexpected. So I'm correct about this point, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. It's the other topic that we discussed in the first episode of Conversations with Mother Earth is responsibility. The opposite was about the organic chocolate and about sustainable farming in Ecuador, and how with taking responsibility for our actions, in this particular case, buying organic chocolate and paying a little bit more, but helping farmers on the other side of the world, is something that has a direct influence. How are these two topics linked, serendipity and responsibility for our own actions?
You know, it's interesting because if you think about the world and the challenges we face, a lot of these challenges, especially social and environmental, are very intricate, right? They're complex. We can't know exactly how to solve them. And so one of the problems we've seen, especially in developing countries, you know, where Western do-gooders go in and try to fix a lot of things, but actually have more unintended consequences and do more things harm than good, but also more broadly, is that essentially we have too many people who assume they know how to fix things, rather than actually to be open to the serendipitously emerging new ideas that could actually really help improve things. And so what do I mean with this? What I mean is that a lot of times the serendipity mindset is especially important for intricate, complex problems, because we need to iterate with other people around saying, okay, we know that climate change is happening. We know that XYZ things are important, but how exactly we can do that in the US versus in Ecuador, we have to work on this, and probably there will be unexpected solutions in different contexts. Exactly. And if we don't have that openness, if we have a functional fixedness that doesn't allow us to be open to these solutions, then that is actually really irresponsible, even if we think we do well and good, right? And so I think that's really about saying there's a certain humility in that mindset that says, yes, it's vision and everything is great, but don't assume you know everything, because that actually is more harm than does more harm than good.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a very good point that you're bringing, Christian, because in our episode about the soil, we talk exactly about that. How can we cultivate local solutions instead of say, oh, it helped, it worked in the United States, it must work in Kenya, it must work in Nigeria, it must work in South Africa, it must work in Kazakhstan. Well, it doesn't. And there are reasons for that. And as you said, when we are open to the local solutions and maybe even pair it with the local knowledge and local traditional knowledge, maybe we get a better solution. So that goes in a similar direction. And the humility, of course, plays an important role. We have to understand that we cannot plan everything. This is what's so difficult for us humans. So from time to time, especially, and this is linked with my next question, especially we would like to avoid certain encounters inside. We say, oh my God, I really wish I did not meet that person. The serendipity was again in place, but we met somebody maybe who was not so, let's say, intriguing, or the person maybe even opened up in parts of us that we don't want to see. What are your thoughts on that part, the darker side?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I feel that the darker side of serendipity shows in a couple of ways, right? One way is really that idea that, you know, we need some kind of filter, being it based on values, on principles, or something else that doesn't get us into dangerous territory, right? Like imagine the scenario where, let's say, you serendipitously meet a trader who gives you insider information about Bitcoin, right? And then you buy all the Bitcoin in the world. That's great in the short run, right? Because you might make a lot of money, but in the mid to long run, you might have compromised your values. You might be now, you know, having a problem with the authorities and so on. And so the point is, serendipity doesn't always have to be good. It has to be driven in some way by our values, by our principles, by the things we care about. And to your point, also a filter can help us then to filter which people do we actually want to interact with in which ways and want to have serendipity with versus not. And the second point that I think is extremely important also is serendipity and societal inequality, right? Because if you think about it, so a lot of my work is in low-income contexts, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, in part of Nairobi or in the Cape Flats in Cape Town. And, you know, the serendipity starting level, the base level of potential serendipity is so much lower than for me here in the West Village in New York, where I have access to education, to networks and everything else. And so the point also is, how do we essentially work on the surroundings of, you know, the type of networks people have, the type of education, so on, that allow people to have more serendipity, so that serendipity actually doesn't make that inequality even higher and higher and more and more and more, right? Because I have a lot of serendipity, because I also have a lot of that kind of network and everything else set up, versus I think one of our tasks is to also be part of shaping networks and education systems that allow other people to have similar amounts of serendipity. And then the third one, which is actually my favorite in terms of how we really have to be cautious about it, is how the serendipity for someone might be bad luck for someone else, right? So take the example, if you're a policeman or a policewoman and you know, you somehow have a hunch that you know, like that there might be something in a garden somewhere, and randomly you encounter like a whole Mariana garden, right? And you get the kind of policewoman of the month award. But you know, it was this 80-year-old pensioner who really just wanted this, like in the last kind of part of their life, they just wanted to enjoy a little bit their own garden, and that was just the life, right? So it's kind of like the serendipity of the policewoman actually is really bad luck for the pensioner who goes to prison for the last kind of couple of years of their life. And so the point is that sometimes serendipity for some people might actually mean bad luck for other people.
Yeah. And sometimes we look at certain events, we wish maybe they did not happen, but on the other side, you know, we have to take good with bad with the good, or good with the bad, or which way we are turning it, because at the end, everything makes sense, doesn't it? You're mentioning the important point of values, and this is what we also, it's a part of my work is also that we ground ourselves in our reality, in our values, in who we are, not being necessarily, I don't know, culturally defined in I'm just this and I'm just that, but that we define, that we ground ourselves in who we are. And this, of course, also influences our serendipity, because then we can say, this is who I am, this is what I stand for. And of course, this helps us meet people who are like-minded or think in a similar direction. Wouldn't you say so?
Yeah, and I think it really goes in two ways, right? The one way is that we know what to connect the dots to, because I know then, oh, like even if I see serendipity with someone, if I don't feel they're aligned in terms of values, some of my biggest mistakes in life came from serendipity with people where my gut told me, yeah, don't go there. But then I was like, no, but it could be great. And my brain told me do it. And so it's really kind of, in a way, values help us to course correct and to really realize, okay, maybe I shouldn't go for this potential opportunity here, and because it isn't aligned necessarily, or the person isn't aligned with what I stand for. But also then the other way around, in terms of that values are interesting, I think, to also, you know, define what are non-negotiable values versus what are values that, you know, are important, but they are malleable depending on the different situation. And I've learned that a lot, you know, especially in my work in developing countries, where I took certain assumptions for granted and certain values for granted, and then you go into other contexts and you're like, you know what? It's quite arrogant to assume that I know which values are supposed to be better than other values. And so I think values are interesting also because it's really, and that comes back to the humility aspect, that an open mind also means to reevaluate values over time and to say, you know what, maybe that value doesn't serve me. Maybe that value doesn't serve the world, and maybe I have to reconfigure that based on what I'm learning along the way. So I feel one of my key learnings in life was to say there are some non-negotiables, you know, you don't compromise integrity, you don't compromise loyalty, things like that. But then also there are kind of values that are amenable to change depending on the different contexts.
You were mentioning an interesting point. I have to tell you an interesting anecdote that just came up to my mind. It's kind of linked with what you were saying when we with the values, but sometimes communicating this, we don't always know why, and then it turns out that this was precious or valuable to somebody. We were giving leadership training in Abu Dhabi, and the room was in this room were all men. And at some point, I don't know why it happened. I really can't explain. I normally don't share this in a certain setting. I said what my purpose was, because we talked about leadership and purpose. And I said, at some point, I was in a deep hole and I had to define this purpose for me. And I said, my purpose is, I serve Mother Earth and I serve one race, the human race. And the room was, as I said, full of men. There were some Emirati, some participants from Bangladesh, India, across the Middle East, Jordan, Egypt, Morocco, and so on. And I saw these blank faces. They were looking at me like, what is she talking about? And I thought later after the workshop, my goodness, why did you say that? You know, why did you mention this is your own purpose? You did not need to share this in a setting like that. However, the next day, one of the guys from India actually quoted me. And to him, it meant the world. To him, it meant a lot, because he felt in this workshop like he belonged. And if I planned this, I would not have said it. Yet, I lit up that time one person's day, made it a better place. So you don't sometimes know how things can work out. I was certainly the evening before, I thought, my goodness, why did you do that? And I understood the next morning why I had to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the interesting thing also, not that sometimes at hindsight we connect the dots, right? Sometimes we try to put it in foresight, but in hindsight now, you know, I guess especially for people, like if I think about, you know, different contexts where maybe there's a hierarchy of different, you know, nationalities, or a hierarchy of different
exactly
does which job and things like this, right? And then if you in a way equalize that in your workshop, right, that in a way gives a lot of hope to people in the workshop. So I can definitely see how that made probably the day of more than one person.
Yeah, I mean, he really was. He quoted me the next day. He was so uplifted and he was so happy. So yeah, sometimes we don't know how we work, how we influence other people. And one of the reasons why I liked this quote from your book so much, and I'll quote it now verbatim. Imagine a world driven by curiosity, opportunity, and a sense of connection, rather than by fear, scarcity, and jealousy. A world in which enormous challenges such as climate change and social inequality are being tackled by solutions that are bold and up to the challenge. In our fast-changing world, many of the emerging problems are so complex that much of the future will be driven by the unexpected. The reason this quote resonates with me because it echoes the core message of Conversations with Mother Earth, namely the need to imagine a world where we value each other again as fellow human beings, no matter which job we do, because each of us is striving to make a living for ourselves and our families, hopefully while respecting the delicate balance of nature on our planet. Imagine a world that despite our differences, we accept, face, and tackle common problems together because we value the world in which we live in. Christian, it was a pleasure talking to you today.
Absolutely. I think, you know, to your point, the question of how we overcome, especially partisan divides, right, in this world that is so partisan, that is so, you know, unfortunately not only diverse, but actually without common denominators in some areas, like thinking about what makes us, right?
Yeah.
A common denominator, what makes us human, what is it that brings us together? I think that's at the core of a lot of the things that will be important in the future.
Yeah.
So
Agree. Absolutely agree. Yeah, exactly. So that is wonderful talking. I could continue on and on, but I do recommend your book because it's truly a fascinating read. I really mean it. And of course, my listeners will want to know, where can they find you? Where can they find your book?
Yeah, the homepage is serendipitymindset.com, and I'm at Chris Serendip on Twitter.
Okay, so we can find you. We can find you there. Dear listeners, as you know, you can find all these links in my own Instagram, Facebook profiles, and of course the profiles of Granite Press on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Wonderful, really wonderful, Christian. Thank you so much for joining Conversations with Mother Earth.
Thank you so much for having me.
This concludes today's conversation, brought to you by Granite Press. I hope it was a serendipitous episode to you. Next week, following today's insights, we will serendipitously allow wind to carry us away. Join us again.